especially single molecule FRET and FCS. And they investigate the structure and dynamics of biomolecular assemblies, and mainly focusing on membrane proteins such as G protein coupled receptors and transcription complexes. And as you can see at the first slide, he's going to give us a small dancing lesson, how to dance with two dragons. So I guess the stage is yours.
Okay. Okay, so change my hat. So what I'm going to try to tell you about today is, yeah, how to, as an image, how to dance with two dragons. So as you have seen, and you knew before, of course, but as you have seen, and especially after Philip Tinefeld talk this morning, fluorophores can be quite nasty, and you need to handle them with care, and you need to know what you do when you are dealing with them. So just like a wild beast. So that's why I use this image to illustrate this. And yeah, so I will tell you today about FRET and what all the nasty things that can happen with one fluorophore, usually in a single color experiment. They become even more complicated when you deal with two fluorophores and two fluorophores that are going to interact with each other, which is the case in a FRET experiment. Okay, so this is what I'm going to try to cover today. I will not go deeply into the details of single fluorophore photophysics, but I will try to give you a flavor on what you need to be careful about, and how you can put in evidence the fact that you have a fluorophore photophysics that is messing with your FRET measurement. Okay, so I'm going to start with this one slide introduction. Actually, I took it from a review from Philippe and TJ Ha that talks about fluorophore photophysics, and I like it very much. I like this picture because what you have here. You have actually two different experiments on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, and well, they look pretty much the same actually on purpose. But in fact, what you have here is what they call biophysics, which means it's a FRET experiment where you have, I guess, a Nolide junction that is labeled with a donor and an acceptor, and then you have conformational change, and the distance between the donor and the acceptor changes. And as a result, you see this interconversion between two states. High FRET state here, where the donor is low, acceptor is high, and a low FRET state. And you have this interconversion between the two. This is biophysics. This is a real event that is taking place in terms of structural change. And here, what you have here is photophysics. So here is just a double-stranded DNA labeled with two fluorophore. There is no conformational change, but the only thing that is going on is that the acceptor is blinking between an on and off state. So when the acceptor is on, basically you see high FRET. When it's off, you see low FRET. And you have, due to the blinking of this dye, you see exactly the same time of interconversion between the two. So I guess my purpose today will be to show you how to not to mix photophysics and biophysics. Okay, so this is going to be the outline of my talk. I will start with some reminder about the principle of threat. Then I will tell you about how we measure threat, and most of my talk will focus on single molecules because this is where the photophysical events are especially important and can disturb your measurement. I'm going to talk a little bit about the dyes that are used for this type of experiments, and I see that someone suggested a round table about this, so I'm open for further discussion. How do we detect and try to solve photophysical problem in the context of single molecule threat? And also how we can exploit photophysical events to perform new types, let's say, of single molecule threat experiments. And finally, I will give a few words about how single molecule threat can be used for structural biology and what are the current efforts in this direction. Okay, so let's start with a Perrin-Jablonski diagram. I guess Perrin has been probably in Les Ouches at some point, so I think it's an homage to him. He also was a founder of the CNRS, I think. Yeah, so this is a oversimplified Perrin-Jablonski diagram in the context of threat. So here you just have the donor fluorophore that is going to be excited, and then of course it's going to emit, it's going to relax to the ground state through radiative, that is fluorescence, or non-radiative pathways. I mean, we have seen this many times already, and there are many other things that can go, like going into the triplet state, but I didn't put this on this slide. So when you have just the donor, you define the excited state. I mean, the fluorescence lifetime of the donor as 1 over Kr plus K and R. So now, when you have another molecule, the acceptor that comes into proximity, and if a bunch of conditions are fulfilled, you can have this non-radiative energy transfer between the two molecules through dipole-dipole interaction, and this adds another path of de-excitation for the donor that you will put into this equation. This is the excited state lifetime of the donor in the presence of acceptor, and you see that you're just adding the threat rate here. The efficiency of the energy transfer process between the donor and the acceptor is in fact the quantum yield of the threat process, which is K threat divided by all rates. And so if you put these two equation here into that one, you end up with having a definition of the threat efficiency, which is 1 minus tau dA over 2D, which are here. Okay, so as you know, the process of energy transfer is distance dependent. It depends on the distance between the two fluorophore as a factor 6. So you have this curve here where you can plot the transfer efficiency as a function of the distance. And what we define for a specific pair of dyes in a specific environment and with specific orientation is the R0 value, R0 value, which is the distance for which, for this pair of dye, you have an efficiency of transfer of 50% or 0.5. And then you have this relationship between the efficiency of threat, R0, and the distance between the two fluorophores. So if you know R0, if you measure the efficiency, of course you can get the distance. And so due to this R6 dependency, it turns out that you can accurately measure distance between roughly 0.5 R0 and 1.5 R0. So for example, if your R0 is 40 angstrom, you will be able to measure distance between roughly 20 to to 60 angstrom. And if we look at the values of R0 that are available for the pair of dies that we are used to deal with in the visible range, you have R0 value going. In this figure, it said between 20 to 80. More realistically, it's more 30 to 70, let's say. But this means that the range of distance that you can measure with FRET goes between 50 and 20 angstrom up to 100 angstrom. Okay, so a few words on how you calculate R0. So in this R0 equation, you have 4 parameters. Phi d is the donor quantum yield in the absence of acceptor. So this is something that you need to measure experimentally. Traditionally, this was made in comparison with a reference, but as we have seen in other talk, you can use an integrated sphere to get absolute value of quantum yields. I don't know about the pros and cons of the two methods. You have n, which is a medium refraction index, and we estimate for biological macromolecules that this value is 1.4. You have the spectral overlap between the emission of the donor and the excitation of the acceptor. I will come back to this, and the orientation factor. I will come back to this as well. So the spectral overlap, you can calculate it pretty easily. You need to measure the emission spectrum of your donor and the excitation spectrum of your acceptor, and then you calculate this product over the full spectrum. So here, for example, is something I calculated for Psi3 and ATO647N, and you find this value for the spectral overlap. The kappa square is the infamous orientation factor, and this relates the fact that the dipole-dipole interaction strongly depend on the relative orientation of the two dipoles. So here on this scheme, you have the donor dipole, the acceptor dipole, and this is a vector joining them, and you can define a bunch of angles between them. And kappa square is defined as cosinus phi t, which is this theta t, this angle here, and theta d and theta a, theta d being the angle between d and r, and theta a between r and a. And so if you consider all possible orientation in space, kappa square can get a value between 0 to 4, so it's a huge range of value. The value of 4 is obtained when the transition moments are collinear with R. So this is what you get, for example, if the dipole is here and the donor dipole is here and the acceptor dipole is here, you get a value of 4. And if the two are perpendicular, you get the value of 0. So you can imagine that this fluorophore can take all type of orientation in space. So measuring this relative orientation is something that in practice we do not do. And to be able in a realistic way to get a realistic value for kappa square, and thus to be able to measure a distance between fluorophore, what you need to take care of is that your fluorophore are freely rotating in space. So if you have a rapid reorientation randomization of your probes during the donor lifetime, you have this kappa square value that equals 2/3. So this is an integration of all possible value of the orientation that gives you this value. So this means that during the donor lifetime, which means when the donor is in excited state, you need to have at least one of these dipoles that is able to reorient, which means typically in a few nanoseconds. So in order to achieve this, when we label, for example, we label a protein with organic fluorophore, we use carbon linker with several carbon, typically 6 carbon, to give this flexibility. And if you measure, if you really your dye is not stacking to your protein, if you measure typically the reorientation time, the rotational correlation time of a dye with this type of linker, you end up with something in a few hundreds of picosecond time scale. So for an excited state lifetime of the donor of few nanoseconds, you are fine, you reorient quickly. To be sure of that, one quick way is to measure the fluorescent anisotropy of the donor and the acceptor. And if you have an anisotropy value, this is a rule of thumb, below 0.2, we generally consider for a big complex like a protein that we have a sufficient rotational mobility. If you want to be more accurate, you can use time-resolved anisotropy to measure the axial depolarization factor of the donor-acceptor transition moment, as has been shown in this paper. But at least, if one of the two fluorophores is able to rotate, we estimate this is a good approximation. And something to keep in mind is that this approximation is even better if the fret efficiency is low. Because when the fret efficiency is low, this means the donor spends more time in the excited state. So basically, your dye have more time to reorient during this process. So if you want to be accurate in a distance measurement, you better be in a low fret range than in the high fret range because of this fact. Okay, so now we have been talking about R0. If we want the distance, we need to be able to measure the fret. So how do we do that? So as we have seen from the definition of the fret process, we can measure the donor excited state lifetime in the presence and the absence of the acceptor. So this is what you get in the presence of acceptor here in the absence, and from there you can calculate the fret efficiency. So what is nice with this measurement is that it's an absolute measurement, which means it doesn't depend, for example, on the concentration of your sample, and it doesn't require correction factors like for spectral crosstalk or this kind of things. I'm going to talk about this later. So this type of measurement it's a basis of what you do in FLIM microscopy, fluorescence lifetime imaging microscopy, where you evaluate fret through excited state lifetime measurement. This measurement can be done at the ensemble level in a cuvette using a TCS-PC or phase modulation. It can be done as well on single molecule, as we will see. Another way of measuring fret is to measure the quantum yield of the donor in the presence or in the absence of the acceptor. This is related to this, but now it's intensity measurement, if you want. The problem is that it's a quantum yield measurement, so the quantum yield measurement is harder to perform. It has to be done, as we say, relative to a reference, for example. And looking at this is the basis of what you do in fret measurement by photobleaching of the acceptor. So this has been done for many years as a way to measure fret in living cells. So basically you have your sample labeled with donor and acceptor, and then you photobleach all the acceptor, and you see an increase in the donor intensity. This type of measurement has been very popular, but as we know now, the problem with strongly illuminating a fluorescent protein, for example, that can lead to nasty things like photoconversion to another fluorescent protein, for example. So this type of measurement you have to be very careful when you do this type of measurement, because what you might see in a donor intensity channel might be in fact a protein that is photoconverted to a donor-like protein. Okay. A third way of measuring fret that that I'm going to cover is actually the one that is mainly used in the field of single molecule threat. Basically, you can estimate threat from this equation where f prime is the number of photons emitted by the acceptor, f prime A by the acceptor, f prime D by the donor, and phi A and phi D are their respective quantum yield. Okay, so let's assume you can measure the quantum yield properly. You still need to measure the number of photons emitted, but this is extremely difficult because you don't know how much a molecule emits photon. What you get is a number of photons collected, right? So there is a relationship between the number of photons that you collect, that you detect, and the number of photons that is emitted through this factor that we call the detection efficiency. And the detection efficiency, in fact, is quite hard to determine in an absolute way. You know, on your microscope or your spectrophotometer, you don't know exactly how many of the emitted photons you really collect. But nevertheless, there are ways to go around this limitation. And typically what we do is that we calculate and we estimate this factor, this ratio gamma, that takes into account the two quantum yields and the two detection efficiency. So this gamma ratio is something that we can, at the single molecule level, determine experimentally. And then, when we have this gamma factor, we can calculate the threat efficiency from the detected photon in the acceptor and the donor channel, given that you know this gamma factor. Okay, so this is the way you calculate what we call the ratiometric threat in single molecule experiments. So talking about single molecules, just a reminder on why we want to do that, and especially in the field of I'm interested in, which is structural dynamics of proteins. So if you look at an ensemble of molecules that undergo threat, for example, what you are going to typically have is an average value. And this average can have two different sources. Yes, the average between different values comes from the fact that you can have first what we call static heterogeneities. So static heterogeneities reflects the fact that in your sample you have your molecules that can be into different states. So if you do an ensemble measurement, for example, you might see a yellow color, but in fact this yellow color comes from molecules that are in different states, like the green molecule and the red molecule. So at very low concentration, at single molecule level, you can see them, but if you look at the ensemble, you just get an average value, which is of course much less informative. The second source of heterogeneity that you want to take into account is dynamic heterogeneities, which means that you have molecules that are changing states as a function of time. So imagine, for example, a protein that has a conformational change between two states, state A and B, that lead to different color, different threat efficiency. So each of the protein in your solution will switch between the two states independently from the other. And so if you look at billions of molecules at the time, like in an ensemble experiment, what you get is an average value that reflects the properties of each of the two states and their relative abundancy. However, of course, if you can watch the molecule one by one, you will see each molecule going between the two states. You can extract the characteristics in terms of distance, for example, of each of the states, and you can extract the time that the molecule spends in each of the states, which is, of course, much more informative. And as well, when you are doing, when you are dealing with single molecule, you can easily detect and correct the photophysical effect that might perturb your experiment. So to look at single molecule and including in the field of single molecule threat, you have two general technologies to do that. You are probably more familiar with the wide field, let's call it like this, wide field technique, where you use typically total internal reflection microscopy to illuminate the molecule at the surface of your sample, either a cover slip or, for example, the membrane of a cell. So what I've shown here is a total internal reflection microscope based on a prism, but you can do it also through the objective. This is the basis of most, I mean, probably all the commercial microscope. You do through the objective. And if you have a very sensitive camera, you can watch single molecule on your surface. And what you can do for each molecule, you can get its intensity as a function of time. So this way, you can look at immobilized or 2D diffusing molecule at the surface. You watch hundreds of molecules in parallel. For each molecule, you have a very long time trace, basically between the start of the experiment and irreversible photobleaching. But the temporal resolution is relatively low. It depends on the integration time on your camera, typically in a millisecond time scale. The other way of looking at single molecule, which is probably less used, at least in the field of biology, is my animation won't work, but is in confocal geometry. So what you have here is basically a modified confocal microscope. You have your laser that define an observation volume, and in your solution, or it can be in your cell, you have your labeled molecule at a concentration that is so low that most of the time you have nothing in your observation volume. And from time to time, you have a molecule that is coming, that is crossing this observation volume, that is emitting photons. The emitted photons go through a pinhole and then are detected in a single photon detector. And basically, the type of data that you have is, as a function of time, you have here the number of photons. So you have noise, background, and then from time to time, you see a molecule that is crossing your volume, emitting photon that you detect and collect. So in this configuration, you can look at 2D or 3D diffusing molecule. However, here you are looking at one molecule at the time, and you cannot follow it for a long period of time. You are limited by the diffusion of your molecule when it crosses the volume. Typically, it's in a millisecond time scale. Nevertheless, you can detect subpopulation with a very high temporal resolution, typically down to the nano to microseconds. And this way you can detect fast structural dynamics, for example. In a few labs, they combine the immobilization strategy with a confocal detection, which allows you to watch for a single molecule for extended period of time with this excellent time resolution. I think many data that Philippe Tinefeld showed this morning were done into this configuration, which is confocal geometry on immobilized molecule. Okay, so if you want to do FRET, you need to complicate a bit your setup. So instead of having just one detector, you're using this time two detectors. You have a dichroic to separate the emission of the donor channel and the acceptor channel. So you end up with two time trace, the time trace for donor excitation, donor emission, and the time trace for donor excitation, acceptor emission. And so this is a very, probably the first, it is the first paper published by the group of Shimon Weiss on single molecule FRET on diffusing molecule. And what they did here is that they detect each single molecule event, and then for each molecule, you calculate this ratio that we nowadays call the proximity ratio, which was just the fluorescence that you get in the acceptor channel divided by the fluorescence that you get in the donor channel plus the one in the acceptor channel. So this is an uncorrected ratio that nevertheless reports on the FRET efficiency between the two dyes. And so in their historic experiments, they mixed two DNA where the donor and acceptor were separated either by 7 or 14 base pair. So what you see is that for 7 base pair, you have this very high threat efficiency, that's DNA7, and for 14 base pair, you have a threat efficiency that is lower, an apparent threat efficiency proximity ratio of 1.7, and then you add this population here with an proximity ratio of 0. And this shows the fact that some of your acceptors are just not there, either because it's blinked, either because it's bleached, or either because your sample is not perfect and some of your DNA is just labeled with just a donor. So you can see that with this type of histogram, number of molecules as a function of threat, you can really know what is going on in your sample. You can clearly separate your free population. But now imagine that you do an ensemble experiment with this type of sample. If you calculate the average of all this, you end up with a value around 1.4. And this value 1.4 corresponds to basically nothing. There is no molecule with a value of threat of 0.4. So here, immediately you see the why it's important to look at this type of sample, complex sample, like you get in biology at a single molecule level. Okay, so it was so far so good. This technology was just fine. It has a number of advantages. It's not really necessary to have high yield of labeling or to know it exactly, as contrary to what you need to do for ensemble experiment, and you can recover subpopulation. However, there is a lot of still there was a lot of problem that you have the presence of this donor-only species due to probably to acceptor photophysics or lack of good labeling. The technique is also sensitive to fluorescent contamination. Typically, the fluorescent contamination appears in the bluest channel, which is a donor channel in our case. And most of the contaminant will appear as donor-only species. And as you will see, with this simple technology, it was not possible to recover the correction factor that you need to be able to extract the real threat efficiency, the one that will give you the ability to calculate the distance. Okay. And so when I was a postdoc in Shimon Weiss' lab, together with Achilles Kapanidis and Ted Lawrence, we have been working on this problem, and the solution was to add a second laser that allows you to directly probe the emission of the acceptor. And this technique was called alternating laser excitation, or ALEX. So now the idea is that you add a second laser and you quickly alternate between the two lasers, the green that excites the donor and the red that excites the acceptor. So you need to imagine that you alternate so fast, typically in a microsecond time scale, that when the molecule will cross your observation volume, it will be excited sequentially by the green and the red laser several times, dozens of times. Okay. This is what is represented here. And then you have the same detection system. What you can do is that in your time trace now, you can separate your photon flux into another dimension, which is when you get specific values when the green laser is on, and you get other value when the red laser is on. So now instead of having 2 photon stream, you end up with 4 photon stream. Donor excitation, donor emission. Donor excitation, acceptor emission. This is what you had before. And now you have 2 extra photon stream. Acceptor excitation, acceptor emission. That's the direct excitation of the acceptor, which gives you some values. And then you have acceptor excitation, donor emission. So this is the reverse of threat. So basically that's 0. Okay, there is no photon in this channel. Okay, so in fact at the end you have 3 photon stream. And then what you gonna calculate for each molecule is the proximity ratio, just like before. And we introduce this additional ratio that we call the stoichiometry ratio, which is defined as the fluorescence, the total fluorescence you get when you excite the donor, divided by the same thing plus the total fluorescence you get when you excite the acceptor. And this S ratio is going to take a value between 0 and 1. And basically, if you have an acceptor-only molecule, this value will be 0, so S will be equal to 0. If you have a donor only, this here acceptor excitation will be 0 and S will be equal to 1. And if you have a donor acceptor sample, a molecule, the S value will get an intermediate value. And depending on the relative power of the laser, you can tune this value to be a 1.5. Okay, so now each of your molecule will be represented on a two-dimensional histogram with here the apparent FRET efficiency, the proximity ratio, and here the stoichiometry. And by doing so, you can separate all your species in your sample, the donor only, the complexes, and the acceptor only. So now if you imagine that your acceptor is off during the measurement, in fact, it will appear as a donor only, so it will appear up here, and you will be able to distinguish this with the case of a molecule where the donor and the acceptor are there, they are active, but the distance is too high, too long to have FRET. So basically, you can separate donor only from a real FRET measurement, a real large distance between the donor and the acceptor. And yeah, so this was the demonstration of it. If you take donor-only sample, you got all your molecules here, up there. Acceptor-only sample is here. And for donor-acceptor complexes at various distance, you get an S of 0.5, and you get changes in the FRET efficiency. Okay, so I'm going to finish with this part by presenting you the latest advancement on this type of technology. So the state of the art now is to use not CW laser, continuous laser, but pulse laser, combined with TC-SPC detection, and this allows us to measure for each single molecule its excited state lifetime, because you have the time resolved information. And we also use 4-channel detection, which is we still have 2 colors, but we also have polarization resolved detection. So this way, in addition to the ratiometric measurement of the photon based on color, you have the ability to measure the polarization of each of your single molecule, and this way verifies that the polarization, for example, is low. To verify the orientation condition. Okay, so this type of detection is called multiparametric fluorescence detection. It was a pioneer in Klaus Seidel lab in Düsseldorf. And the use of pulse excitation and alternated pulse excitation, which means we do the same that I showed you before, having a green and red laser alternated, but this time with pulse laser. He was pioneer in the Shimon Weiss and Don Lamp labs. So not what you get for each single molecule, it's excited state lifetime, it's anisotropy, and the ratiometric effect efficiency. You have ALEX, you can look at stoichiometry and photophysical artifact, as I told you. And what we have introduced in 2013 is, instead of using several lasers to do this excitation, we do this with a supercontinuum source, which is also called a white laser. And by adding on one channel an optical delay, what we can have is interleaved pulse of any color we want. Because with this supercontinuum source, you select the color just by using filters. So I can generate alternated pulse of any color I want in order to match the fluorophore of my experiment. Just a few words about measuring excited state lifetime. In Ensemble, there are 2 ways of doing it. You can either do it in a time domain or in a frequency domain. In a time domain, the principle is that you have a pulse of laser that goes into your sample, and you record the temporal response of your sample. And this is typically what we do for single molecule. But in Ensemble, you can also use the frequency domain measurement, where you excite your sample with a modulated light source, and you look at the demodulation of the light and is dephasing as compared to the excitation. And you need to know that this type of measurement, it can be very fast if you have an ensemble of molecules, but it requires enough photons to be able to measure this demodulation and dephasing. And so this is not adapted to single molecule where your photon budget is very limited. So we use time domain measurement to always on single molecules. So this time domain measurement looks like this. You have the pulse of your laser that is combined with your electronic response to give you the instrument response function that you see here in blue. And in red, what you see is the response of your sample, the fluorescence decay. So this is here you have thousands of photons. This is an ensemble measurement where you can see, for example, that your fluorescence decay is linear in a log scale, which means you have a single exponential decay. What is good about this type of measurement on single molecule is that if you assume that you have a single exponential decay, indeed, you can approximate and measure the excited state lifetime for each single molecule just with a few dozens of photons. Typically, we use, I think, 40 photons. If we just have 40 photons for a single molecule, we can fit with a linear decay and get an approximate value of the excited state lifetime. And so you can have this type of histogram where here you have a number of single molecules as a function of their lifetime. So you see, for example, here you have two populations that you can distinguish based on their lifetime. So it can be a low fret and a high fret, for example. And then if you want more accuracy, you can treat your data in the way that you can collect the photons coming from hundreds of single molecules that have the same characteristics, and you can recreate a decay that you can fit with a more accurate model. So now you have thousands of photons, and if, for example, you have very, very fast dynamics, on a nanosecond time scale, for example, this will give you a non-exponential decay, and you will see it in this type of measurement as a non-exponential. Okay. So to wrap up this part, when we measure single molecule fret on single molecule as a state of the art, we can obtain this type of two-dimensional histogram where you have here the stoichiometry, here the fret efficiency. If you just select the complexes, you get this type of fret histogram, number of molecules as a function of fret. You can select subpopulation and get the excited state lifetime. You can select subpopulation and do a correlation analysis, for example, that will give you access to diffusion time or dynamic time, as I will show you just after. And you can look at the shape of this fret histogram and start to infer whether your system is dynamic or not. So imagine, for example, that you have a protein that is interconverting between two states, a high fret and a low fret state. If this interconversion is slow relative to the measurement time, I told you a molecule spends a few milliseconds in the volume. So if this interconversion is slow relative to this millisecond time scale, what you will see is that some molecule will cross the volume in one state and some molecule will cross the volume in the other state. So at the end of the day, what you get is two very well separated populations. But now, if the dynamic is fast, if the dynamic is faster than the diffusion, for example, 100 microseconds, what you get is that when the molecule is crossing, you get an average value of these various states, and what you get in that case will be a very wide distribution that will narrow and narrow and narrow as when the dynamic goes faster up to a point where you will just get the average value. So in some methods, I would not talk about this, but looking at the shape of this histogram is a way to extract structural dynamics. So another way to look at structural dynamics and photophysics, I just mentioned before, is by correlation analysis. So imagine that you have your signal in any of the channels, so it looks like this, count as a function of time. what you can do is a correlation analysis. And on the correlation analysis on diffusing molecule, if you have no photophysical event, what you will get is this type of curve. And from this type of curve, you can extract the diffusion time. So basically, the longer the molecule stays in a volume, the longer the diffusion time you're going to get. But now imagine that there is something going on the signal while the molecule is crossing the volume. For example, blinking. Molecule going on and off while it's crossing the volume. What is going on there is that at very short time scale, basically within the burst, you're going to have a fluctuation. And this fluctuation, you're going to see them in your correlation curve as an extra correlation at short time scale. And this is what was illustrated in this experiment. So this is rhodamine 6G in sucrose at different concentration, but just look here at the top curve. So in green, you have the diffusion curve of this rhodamine. And then what I did, they increased the laser power, I think 30 or 40 times. So by increasing the laser power, what you do is that you start to have your molecule that is blinking. And you see it here immediately as an additional correlation at short time scale. So this way you can separate the blinking of your molecule with the diffusion. So that's one way of looking at photophysics at short time scale. Okay, so I will briefly now mention the other way of looking at single molecule threats, this time on single molecule. So I presented you the total internal reflection microscope, and now for the detection part, what you do is that you split your light into two channels. You have a dichroic mirror, you have filter, and then you image these two channels on the same camera chip. So what you're going to have is, on one side, you're going to see single molecules corresponding to the donor emission, and on the other side, you're going to have signal corresponding to the acceptor channel. And when I was a postdoc, what I introduced is the use of alternating laser excitation in this context as well. So same thing, instead of using one laser, you use two lasers, you alternate them, and what you do is that you're taking one image with the green laser on, and then one image with the red laser on. So at the end, what you get is donor excitation, donor emission, donor excitation, acceptor emission, and you get this extra channel, which is acceptor excitation, acceptor emission. So in the same principle of what we did on solution diffusing molecule, here for immobilized molecule, you're going to be able to probe independently the donor and the acceptor and check their photophysics. This is the nasty data we published at the time, but it was data on immobilized RNA polymerase, which was already problematic to get. But basically, what you can do is that you can separate your signal and your molecule on the S and E channel. So what you have here is molecules that are just labeled with the acceptor, here just with the donor, and here you have your donor acceptor complexes. So then you take each of these single molecule and you can plot its signal as a function of time. So in the case of RNA polymerase, at the time, what we get, so we had the donor and RNA polymerase, the acceptor on DNA, and we wanted to look at the RNA polymerase moving back and forth on DNA. So what we had was this type of curve. And so you see the donor signal going up, down, the acceptor signal going up, down. And if you calculate the apparent threat efficiency, you see changes in threat. But if you look at the threat efficiency of the low threat state, it's 0. So when you see 0, you can be suspicious that this might be photophysics. And this indeed was the case. If on top of this data, you had the signal coming for the direct excitation of the acceptor, which is here in black, you can see that when you excite it directly, simultaneously to the change that you see here, in fact, the acceptor is blinking on, off. So you can basically from your data remove all the time the acceptor was off, and you just end up with real threat changes, which here were basically non-existent. So it was a constant threat. So this is another example of using this technology by Achilles Kapanidis lab in Oxford. It's on RNA polymerase data as well. Here the donor and acceptor are on the DNA. And when the RNA polymerase binds, what is going on is that the DNA opens and bends. So what you expect is that when RNA polymerase bind and move forward, you expect to see an increase in thread because the two dyes are coming together. And this is indeed what you see. You have a very low thread efficiency, and then at some point, thread increase, and then RNA polymerase leaves. It goes down to 0 immediately. And what they have done, they have checked that this is not a photophysical event here by probing directly the acceptor emission upon direct excitation. That's what you see here in gray. And you can see that in this case, the acceptor excitation and emission is constant. So there is no photophysics here. It's really changes in distance. By the way, this is when we started playing with these two alternating lasers that we discovered that Psi5 can be reactivated, as Philip mentioned this morning, because since we were alternating between the two lasers, at some point we realized that the red laser was, we were thinking it was bleaching the acceptor Psi5, but when we put the green laser on, Psi5 was coming back. And this is by playing with these two lasers completely randomly that we started to show that Psi5 can be switched on and off at will with these two lasers. Okay, a few words about the dye we are using in single molecule thread experiments. So these are the more popular dyes that you will find in the literature. I did classify them by color. So typically you have the three main, let's call them color channels that are used are this one, the fluorescein-like channel with Alexa 48 and Atto 48 being favorites. Then you have the green channel with, in the early days we were using tetramethyl-rhodamine, and now it's mainly cyanin-free derivative and or other rhodamine derivatives that are used. In this channel here, people have been using quite a lot, mainly as acceptor, Alexa 594 and Atto 610. And then a very popular series of dye in the red channel is our cyanin derivative, like Psi5 or Alexa 647, for example. Atto 647N has been used quite a lot as well, because very bright and very photostable, causes sometimes other problem. Or Atto 655 has been used a little bit as well. And now there are some efforts, as everybody's doing, to go towards the red as well, and in that case we are using cyanin 7 derivatives. But nevertheless, if you look in the literature, you will find a lot of experiments that have been done using Psi3 and Psi5. So Psi3 as donor and Psi5 as the acceptor. So there is a bit of a rationale between that. Personally, I think there might be a bit of belief as well, because this is a couple of dyes that have been used by T.J. Ha in almost all his career, and is in terms of structural dynamics of protein, is really a reference in the field of single molecule thread. And so I've heard about a lot of lab when they were thinking about trying a pair of dyes. They just try Psi3, Psi5 because it seems to be what it works. And indeed, there is a bit of a rationale, as I said. They have a large spectral separation, almost 100 nanometer between them. They can be photostable in the absence of oxygen, and especially if you are using reducing and oxidizing agent, as Philip said, or Trolox, as TJ introduced. They are commercially available in various chemistry, including click chemistries. And an important point that makes also them different is that at short distance they do not interact with each other. So there is a lot of dyes. If you go to short distance, let's say below 3 nanometer, they will have a tendency to stack together. And in that case, well, one or the two dyes might become completely dark due to the formation of this complex. And this is the case. Typically, you see this with rhodamine dyes, for example. Some of the drawbacks is that, as we heard, Cy5 can react with thiols, not toils, and lead to a dark adduct. They also show cis-trans isomerization. I will talk about this just after. And as a result, especially for Cy3, you have very large quantum unit changes depending on the environment. So I will tell you a bit about this. So you have this for this cyanine dyes. So they have this structure where you have here the polymethylene chain that connects the rings, and you can have a photo-induced isomerization between a cis and a trans configuration, and basically only one of them is fluorescent. Okay, so you have this stable trans configuration that is fluorescent. But if you go to the excited state, you can have isomerization and go to the cis configuration, which is not. And so if you put your dye, and this is especially critical for Cy3. Cy3 is really the most sensitive to this effect. If you put your dye in different environment, that will change the probability of this cis-trans isomerization. As a result, this will lead to huge changes in quantum yield. When Cy3 is isolated in PBS, it has a quantum yield that is very low, around 0.1. But now, if you put it in glycerol, the cis-trans isomerization is much less likely to occur. You will see this huge increase in quantum yield. Okay, so this is just the free dye. And now imagine that you take your dye and you attach it to a protein or a nucleic acid. What is going on is that due to steric hindrance, depending on where you attach your protein, depending on the protein, depending on the nucleic acid, depending on the sequence, you will have very strong effect. So in this paper, they show the attachment of Cy3 on different types of DNA using different chemistries, or they attach it to different protein, helicase 1, helicase 2, whatever it is, or the F1 ATPase, and you see that for each case, basically, you have this huge change in quantum yield. And this is for one configuration. Now imagine that your protein is changing configuration, and that in the two states, Cy3 has different environment, which is highly likely. So in fact, you're going to have two states with different Cy3 quantum yield. So this is something that you really need to be aware of and take it into account in your Fred calculation. One way to circumvent this problem, and this has been done by people in, I think, in molecular probe, or it was in Vitrogen already, maybe, is to create a new dye that was called Cy3b that doesn't have this cis-trans isomerization. So here, what you have is Cy3, and here is Cy3b. So basically, what they did is that they added this ring here in order to stop the cis-trans isomerization. As a result, you have a very strong shift towards the red. But if you look here at their characteristics, the extinction coefficient doesn't change that much. But as you see here, the lifetime increases from 300 picosecond to 2.8 nanosecond, which is much more convenient to measure, actually. And then the quantum yield of the free dye, you go from 4% to 67%, and which means an increase in brightness factor of 8. So personally, I like Cy3b very much for the experiment. The only drawback is that it's only sold by, to my knowledge, by one company, by Amersham, and they don't have a lot of chemistries available. So for Cy3, you find plenty of derivative with substituent to make it more soluble, different chemistries to make it more compatible with protein attachment. For Cy3b, it's much more limited, and I think it's really a limitation. Yeah, just one word about photophysics can be used, can be exploited sometimes to make biologically relevant experiments, let's say. And this is a technique that has been introduced by Soo-Am Young at Illinois. The idea is to modify on purpose the speed of cis-trans isomerization. And by acting on this isomerization, this will lead to a change in the fluorescence, so you can exploit this as a sensor if you want. So for example, what they do is that they take a piece of DNA and they put Cy3 at the end, and they want to look where a protein is going to bind. So if a protein binds very closely to Cy3, it's going to change the cis-trans isomerization rate, and Cy3 will become very, very bright. And actually, you have a dependency on the distance between the protein and Cy3 that will lead to a dependency in the intensity. So this is what you see here. You have the change in Cy3 intensity as a function of the distance between BAM-H1 site and Cy3, and you see that the longer, the farther the protein is from Cy3, the lower the intensity is, and you can see the same change in lifetime. And actually, when they use Cy3b at this position, they don't see any change, as you would expect. So they are selling this technique as a way to measure proximity between two macromolecules, and saying that if FRET is efficient between, let's say, 30 to 90 angstrom, their technique, protein-induced fluorescence enhancement, PIF, will be sensitive at shorter distance. Personally, I think that this works for some protein, but it's really protein dependent, okay? And sometimes it works, sometimes it just doesn't work, because this change in isomerization is really unpredictable. And for those who are French here, I like to call it PIF, because PIF in France is a slang word to say random, okay? So it works randomly, let's say. Okay, so I will now tell you about photophysical problem, detecting and trying to solve them. Oh, there's a bit of fire here. I don't know why. Maybe because I need to speed up. Okay. Just a few words about spectral properties. So, as you know, excitation and emission spectra are pretty wide, and when you are dealing with two fluorophore, you can have some overlap between these spectra. When you measure FRET efficiency, what you are interested in is FRET, is really the emission of the acceptor that comes from energy transfer, okay? But when you measure your signal, what you observe is the fluorescence you get when you excite the donor and when you look at the acceptor. And in fact, the fraction, I mean the part that really comes from FRET is your observable minus 2 contribution that you need to take into account. Okay, so what you want is this. I excite the donor, I have energy transfer, and then my acceptor emits, and I collect photon. So this is the photon coming from FRET. But what you have as well is photons coming from the donor leakage in the acceptor channel. So what this means is that you excite your donor emits light, but a fraction of this light, due to the fact that is emission spectrum is going here into the acceptor channel, you have some crosstalk, and you have some of the light coming from the donor that you detect in the acceptor channel. So that's the first source of crosstalk. And the second source of crosstalk is what we call the direct excitation of the acceptor. And this is due to the fact that your excitation spectrum of your acceptor is here as a small band here at the donor excitation wavelength. Okay, so when you excite the acceptor directly, you have a strong emission, but when you excite the acceptor at the donor wavelength, you still have a little bit of emission. So this is a direct excitation. This has to be taken into account in order to really know what is the fraction of light coming from your FRET events. Fortunately, I won't go into the detail, but especially using alternating laser excitation, we have ways to estimate this factor and correct for them. Okay, so what you can, so this was not really a photophysical problem, but a problem coming from the characteristics in terms of spectra of the dyes. What you can have are problem due to photo bleaching. When it's irreversible photo bleaching, it's pretty easy to deal with. For example, if you have your donors that bleach, when your donor is bleached, you don't have any signal anymore because the donor emission stops. It doesn't transfer to the acceptor, and the acceptor emission through FRET stops this way. When you have the acceptor bleaching, if it's irreversible bleaching, it's a bit more complicated, but not too much. Typically, what you're going to get, so here you see, for example, a single molecule that emits photons in the donor and acceptor channel. You have FRET, and then at this point, the acceptor bleaches. And when the acceptor bleaches, the donor intensity comes up because you don't have the transfer anymore. You have more photon coming from the donor here until the donor bleaches. Okay, so looking, I mean, this irreversible photobleaching is quite easy to deal with. More complicated is the blinking. As you have seen this morning, you have many photophysical chemical processes that can lead to dye blinking, and this happens at various time scales. For example, you can have triplet blinking in a microsecond. You can have radical formation that will last longer. You can have, for example, with Sci5, you can have this adduct with tile that will last for seconds or even minutes. So all timescales are prone to be plagued by photophysical blinking. Moreover, the acceptor blinking can still be absorbing, for example, if it's in a triplet state. Or not, in some case. So in that case, you will see the donor intensity going up. And all this is influenced by the medium, by the cocktail you add in your solution to photostabilize. Try to photostabilize your fluorophore. And you've seen this morning that works is very efficient, and it should work in most of the case. The problem we have seen is that you cannot always use it because some protein really don't like it. I think methylviogen, for example, is pretty nasty. So as a rule, when we set up a new experiment with a new protein, well, first you always need to have some kind of activity assay, and what we do is that we do the activity assay. It's an ensemble assay usually in the presence of the rocks, and we verify that having all these components in your medium doesn't perturb the activity, of course, of your protein. Okay, so to come back to this blinking effect, there will be detrimental to your measurement depending on 3 time scales. So you need to consider 3 time scales that are interconnected, and where blinking can cause a problem. So you have the structural dynamic timescale. So basically, it's a timescale of the structural change you want to look at. Okay. Typically, if it's a protein domain movement, for example, it's going to be sub-millisecond. If it's an enzyme having an activity, it can be much longer. But well, it depends on what you look at. Second, you have the time scale of the photophysics, the blinking that can happen. And then you have the time scale of your measurement. If you are doing a measurement with a camera, for example, with a millisecond integration time, and you have blinking at the microsecond time scale, in fact, it's going to average out and you will not see it. But on the other hand, if you're doing a measurement with a confocal setup with a very, very high time resolution, it might be a problem in this case. So you have this 3 time scale you need to consider, and if you are unlucky that they are in the same range, well, this is where the problems start. Okay, this is an example. This is what is similar to what I already showed you before, which is a long-lasting acceptor blinking that leads to characteristic transition to 0 threat. Okay, so you see this transition here between a middle threat and a 0 threat. And if you directly excite the acceptor, you see that, in fact, this transition that you see is due to acceptor blinking. So alternating laser excitation by giving you the possibility to directly excite the acceptor allows you to correct for this. As I told you, you can use FCS type of experiment to look at photophysics. But if you do a threat experiment and you have fast structural dynamics, this will give you will lead to microsecond to millisecond fluctuation. And this is something you can see. For example, imagine you have a protein that goes quickly between 2 states, a high threat and a low threat state, faster than the diffusion. When your protein enters the volume, its time trace will be much noisier, but in principle it will look like this. Okay, you have fast fluctuation between the high threat and the low threat state. And if you cross-correlate the signal from the green, which is the donor, and the red, what you will get is this type of curve. If you have a good signal to noise, you will see a positive correlation at a time scale that depends on the diffusion time of your molecule, and then you will see a negative or an anti-correlation that reflects the fact that the 2 signals are anti-correlated. And in practice, this works. So this is our experiment we have done on a G-protein coupled receptor. It was a collaboration with Jean Philippin, who was mentioned this morning, and Klaus Seidel in Düsseldorf. These are it's an extracellular domain of the GPCR. Actually, it's labeled with through a snap tag here, and we have shown that you have fast interconversion between 2 states, which is the active state and the so-called resting state. And if you have a ligand to this receptor, you can mess with the equilibrium between the 2. So if we take threat FCS data on this system, we cross-correlate the donor and the acceptor signal, just like I presented you. You got the curve here in gray, which is zoomed here. So here you have the diffusion, correspond to the diffusion of the protein, a few milliseconds. And then you have this anti-correlation here at the time scale, which is around 50 microseconds, that in fact reports on this dynamics. And so how do we know that, in fact, what we see here is not acceptor blinking? Because acceptor blinking will lead to exactly the same signal, which is anti-correlation between the donor and the acceptor. So in that case, we have 2 ways. We have the biochemical and we have the physicist way, let's call it like this. The biochemical way was to use a mutant, and this mutant cross-links the 2 domains together. So what you expect here is to lose the dynamics, lose the anti-correlation. And indeed, this is a mutant here in blue. This is what you see. With a mutant here, you don't see this anti-correlation anymore. You just see the diffusion. So you have donor-acceptor complexes. It's diffusing, donor-acceptor are diffusing together, but they are not showing interconversion between the 2 states. And there's other way of looking at this, the physicist way, is we take advantage of the fact that we are using pulse interleave excitation to look at the acceptor signal when we excite the acceptor. And if the acceptor is blinking, what you expect is to see extra fluctuation at short time scale. And this is what you see here. you see the diffusion of this molecule. You just excite the acceptor, and you see something that at short time scale is flat. You don't see an extra correlation that will correspond to this acceptor blinking. On the other hand, if you do the same thing, but you look at the donor, just the donor is pretty noisy, but in that case, you need to fit with two timescale, the diffusion and the blinking of the donor. But the blinking of the donor is simply because you have FRET and you have changes between the two states. Okay, so that's ways to look at fast dynamics in a FRET system and distinguish them from structural dynamics. Another I'm going to go quickly. Another point I want to address is the effect of the local environment on the quantum yield. So imagine that you have a protein, you doubly label it, and well, most of the time when the strategy to label a protein is to use cysteines. You put two cysteines and you randomly label them with two fluorophore. So what you end up with is a mixture. Okay, so in that case, you can have the acceptor here and the donor here, or vice versa. And as I told you, for many dyes, their quantum yield depend on the environment. So the question is, will you get the same result here or here? So what we have done with Gilles Truand, a collaborator in Toulouse, they have this strategy to use two unnatural amino acids that they can label in an orthogonal way with two different probes. Okay, so in their protein, in this domain, they can put Psi3, for example, and here in an orthogonal way, they can put Psi5, and vice versa. Okay, so in fact, at the end, we have two proteins where the two labels have been exchanged. And if you do an ensemble measurement on the quantum yield of Psi3 and Psi5 for these two proteins, you see small but significant changes. For example, Psi3 is a bit reduced here, and Psi5 is strongly increased. So from there, you can do a single molecule FRET experiment with these two constructs, and what you see is that you don't get the same result. If you just look at the uncorrected FRET efficiency, the proximity ratio that does not take into account the quantum yield, for this protein, you get a value around 0.4, and if you invert the dye, you have a value around 0.52. Okay, so that's a significant difference between the two. But now, if you take into account the fact that the quantum yields are not the same, you plug them into this gamma factor I told you about, and you can calculate the real FRET efficiency in that case. And what you see is that in that case, you end up with the same FRET efficiency, which tells you that you have the same distance between the donor and the acceptor in the two proteins, which is normal, it's the same protein, you have just changed the dye. But this means as well that if you are not careful about putting the protein at the right position putting the dyes at the right position, defined position in your protein, and calculate the associated quantum yield, you end up with FRET efficiencies that can be wrong. Yeah, I will skip this. A final word about rotations of the fluorophore. As I told you, you can assume that kappa squared go 2/3 for the rapid reorientation of the fluorophore, and you can measure at the ensemble level or at the single molecule level the anisotropy. So the typical case where you want to be in is like this. You have your protein. Your protein tumbling time is typically several nanoseconds, and your probes can freely rotate with a time scale of if you have a long linker in the time scale of 100 of picoseconds. So in that case, you are fine. You have a fast reorientation of the dipole faster than the excited cell lifetime of the donor. But now I just want to address two cases where you're going to have a slow orientation of the dipole. The first case is if your fluorophore is stuck on the protein, it cannot rotate anymore. And the second case is a fluorescent protein. The fluorescent protein, you have your dipole which is in the barrier and is not able to freely rotate. So in that case, what is predominant in terms of rotational mobility is the global tumbling of the protein, is not the local mobility of the probe. So in that case, this will avoid. I mean, you will not be able anymore to do this approximation if you want to be quantitative, but it can be even worse, which means if your dipole are stuck into specific orientation, if you are not lucky, it might be that the two are close, but they cannot do FRET because the orientation is orthogonal, for example. And if you think about the FRET sensor we have seen yesterday about with fluorescent protein, it was mentioned, I think it was Hidaki, it was mentioned that maybe the FRET sensor are working due to changes in distance, but with FP, very often a FRET sensor is working because you have a change of orientation between the two proteins and not really a change in distance. I will skip this part due to lack of time, and I will briefly give you one word about this effort that has been undertaken to now that we are able to measure distance accurately to make FRET as a useful tool for structural biology, and this is done within the context of the PDB, the protein data bank, that is making an effort to integrate new hybrid technologies as tools to complement classic structural biology, which traditionally was X-ray crystallographies, and NMR came into play, then cryo-EM, and now there are new technology, and they want the people to standardize this technology in order. The goal is to be able to put structure in a protein data bank that are reliable. And for this effort, there is a worldwide benchmark study that has just been published by 20 labs, the most famous probably labs doing single molecule FRET in the world, that they use, it's a blind study where they use, it's a blind study, they use unknown FRET sample, and they've been asked to measure the FRET efficiency, the accurate FRET efficiency of these samples. And I think they're using a very standardized method, and they have a very low error on the determination of FRET efficiency. So I think it's a step forward really for standardization of FRET at the single molecule level. I will skip this and give you some further reading. There was a very recent review by Shimon Weiss toward dynamic structural biology. This is a review I mentioned from TJ Ha and Philipp Tinefeld on photophysics. This is the benchmark study I just mentioned. And this is a review by Achilles Kapanidis about taking the ruler to the jungle, which means being able to perform single molecule FRET in the context of living cells. What I've been done so far is mainly preparing protein outside of the cell and then either micro-injecting it or electroporating it within the cell. But to my knowledge, so far, nobody has been able to go label a protein inside the cell and do single molecule FRET measurement there. I think it's really a challenge for the field. Okay, these are my take-home message. Coming back to the dragons, important recommendation when you deal. And if you just want to remind something for my talk, I would like this to be it. Okay, watch for all your dragons. Look at the donor and the acceptor. Alternating excitation is a good way to do this. You need to be careful to watch the two of them simultaneously. Don't change them, okay? You want rotational mobility. You want them to be able to move around so you can average out the orientation. Don't overexcite them, because otherwise, instead of having a nice flow of photons, they will get crazy, and then you are gonna have some blinking fire. And beware of the black dragon. The black dragon is the one that is not giving you any fire anymore. And the black dragon is dark, and when there is a black dragon, the other one can also become overexcited. Okay? All right. If you remember this, I will be happy, and in the context of FRET, of course. Okay, this is my group in Montpellier, and I cannot resist to show you this picture. For those who don't know, Montpellier is close to the Mediterranean, and I didn't think I would see this in my life. This was 3 weeks ago on the Mediterranean, and I mean, in this context, I wanted to show you this. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so any questions?
A very simple one at first is the quantum yield that you measure for the donor is supposedly in water, or where are you supposed to measure it?
Oh, you need to measure it in the context of your protein of interest. So
because you still need to put the refractive index of the solvent on the equation, no? It's one of the first equations you showed.
Yes. So for the R0 equation, you have the refractive index of the solvent that we assume to be 1.4 for a macromolecule medium. For the quantum yield, you don't need to take this into account. But in any case, a good practice is to measure the quantum yield of your protein, the donor labeled just with the donor, in the buffer where you're going to do your FRET measurement, because the quantum yield might depend on the buffer. So.
And the other thing is, to your knowledge, how small can the system be that you can use for single molecule FRET? So if you want to tag a protein in one place and another place to make the FRET, how small can it be, the tag and the dye together?
I'm not sure I understand completely. I will try to answer anyway. If I tell you that there is a limit around 30 angstrom for which below this limit you're going to have 100% FRET, so you're not quantitative anymore. And then, of course, as I told you, you want to put the dyes have themselves some size, and the linker have some size as well. So in this proximity regime, this contribution of the linker and the size of the dye becomes important. Yeah. So as a matter of fact, if you go to longer distance, this effect will be less.
Yeah, so I mean the linker with the dye, because there is one thing that came up as a question in my lab, where there is someone that wants to measure using potentially FRET the movement of certain protein as it folds, etc. So we're trying to find how small it could be, the linker with the tag, so it doesn't interact too much with the dynamics of the protein.
Yeah, so that's
always a problem.
That's hard to predict. Yeah. And then it depends on whether you want to get accurate distance or not. If you want to look at folding, for example, and see what are the parameters between the folding and the unfolded state of a protein, but you don't really care about the distance, I would say you can put a long linker. It will give you an uncertainty on the FRET efficiency, but you don't really care in that specific case.
Okay, thank you.
Hi. You said that the quantum yield of Cy3 is highly affected by its surroundings. And I remember vaguely that this is also true for photostability of Cy3.
Probably. I'm not aware of any rule in that case, but it might be, yeah.
Okay. No, I just wanted to ask whether this is also the case for Cy3b, but...
I don't know. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure there is any systematic study on this. I mean, the photostability before irreversible bleaching. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
More questions?
Maybe I have a stupid question, but I will ask anyway. concerning the fluorescent proteins in cells, when I want to calculate the FRET efficiency, I suppose that the ratio donor acceptor is 1:1, right? But sometimes in cells, I don't know. I can have more acceptor because it's produced more than cells, and that's what I cannot control, the production of the fluorescent protein. So actually the value of the FRET efficiency, there will be FRET anyway because there's a lot of acceptors. So the value of the FRET efficiency is not true actually, because there's like artificial FRET, or I don't know how can I call it.
Okay, that's a complicated issue, but first, I would say maybe provocative.
Sorry, maybe I didn't actually.
No, but I meant provocative. But I would say, why do you care about the absolute FRET efficiency? Because you have two big proteins, okay, that have some size, and this gives you a huge uncertainty about any distance between them. Plus, you have the orientation problems.
Yes.
So. Depending on what you want to measure, why are you performing this experiment? Is it a single molecular sensor? Is it protein-protein interaction?
Yeah, this is protein-protein interactions.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. So, what you care about? I mean, you cannot hope to use this fluorescent protein, for example, to solve the structure of the complex. Let's say based on distance measurement. But in that case, what you care is a fraction of protein that is interacting with the other.
Yeah.
I would guess. Okay. So in that case, yeah, what you get is an apparent average FRET efficiency as a function of the acceptor expression. That's what I will try to plot. I would say.
Okay.
Apparent FRET efficiency as a function of acceptor expression, and this will give you an idea about the strength of the interaction, for example.
Okay.
But I mean, we can discuss this further because I think it's a long.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a long topic.
Thank you.
More questions?
Manu, all the blinking processes that you are assuming are photo-induced blinking, and you are using two different detection modes which take very different power, excitation power. Did you try to relate the excitation power to the blinking processes and to get information on the photophysics which is behind?
No. Well, no. Usually, when I look at my sample, I'm more focused on biology. Yeah. So yeah, I have to look at blinking because I mean I have to take care of it to interpret my data. But yeah, personally, I'm not trying to understand what is going on. But indeed, you have to play with the power to be sure that you are not in the saturation regime, and to verify that you have data that are consistent when you're using different powers. So, but in general, we try to keep the power as low as possible. I prefer to have noisy data with histograms that are a bit wider by keeping the power low instead of taking the risk of entering into photophysical problems.
Yeah, I think you have photophysical problems.
I do have. Yeah, yeah, sure.
But maybe
especially when we excite the acceptor, we are solving some of them, we are detecting some of them, but we are adding others by putting the acceptor in the excited state. So we have to be careful.
Right. Yeah. But anyway, there may be some overlap in information content between the two modes. So maybe you can check if you have some agreement between the techniques or disagreement, and that should be traced to some I don't know, some shelving, for example, under high power of blinking species.
So you mean between the confocal and the microscopy? Yeah. I'm not aware of anybody doing a very careful characterization about the two, and in any case, when we do an immobilize But I think I'm coming back to the biology. When we do an experiment on immobilized molecule, we always start with an experiment in confocal mode, and just because I'm always afraid of artifact due to immobilization. But this is not photophysics. This is biology, right? If you immobilize a protein, I mean, if you want to look at my GPCR, for example, if I want to look at the structural dynamics of this protein, and then I take it and I attach it to a surface, I would be afraid that it perturbs my structural dynamics. For a long fragment of DNA, and if you look at what is going on, let's say on the part that is away from the surface, that might be much less of a problem. But so I always start with a confocal measurement where my system is not perturbed by immobilization before eventually going to immobilization. But yes, this is more biological problem than photophysics.
If there are no more questions, then I guess thanks for the talk.
Thank you.